what has been your experience in Himalayas?
My experience in the Himalayas. Well, first of all, I call them the Himalaya, not with an S, because the original Sanskrit is singular. The British started calling them Himalayas wrongly when we occupied your country. Apologies for that.
That is just history now. You can just say anything.
So I prefer the original name, which is Himalaya, which is derived from the Sanskrit. Okay. My experience, well, I spent quite a lot of time traveling in the Himalaya, mostly Nepal. I've been there filming with the BBC, making documentaries, and also did the Langtang trek before the big earthquake, that kind of thing. And of course, I've seen the Himalaya from the north, from the Tibetan side as well. So yeah, they spoil you for every other mountain range on Earth. Once you've seen the Himalaya, everything else seems very small.
Okay. Yeah. So.
And I showed some pictures of the Himalaya to a French friend of mine who is used to the Alps. Okay. And she was impressed by the steepness of the slopes on the mountains in the Himalaya compared to the Alps, which are much more gentle. So yeah, I recommend everybody to go and see the Himalaya at least once in their life.
Especially now we have a very good geological section which is exposed from Chandigarh to Shimla, and it's a very, very beautiful drive, Yeah, they have really done wonders with the hills and roads. And I think after 100 years, when the railway track was made, the widening of the road has done remarkable. Is a remarkable achievement, and it has reduced the time span from, say, Chandigarh to Shimla in maybe around 2 hours or 1.5 hours.
Wow, it's a big change. Do you remember we went to the church in Kasauli, I think?
Yes, I remember.
Yeah. Well, it turns out that my wife's aunt was married in that church.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's I think then there, when you come here the next time, we'll just go there and see. Maybe the record still speaks about those. That will be a great historical event,
But I also remember that looking from there and seeing the Himalaya, ahead. And well, since then, of course, I spent a fair amount of time in the Himalaya and Tibet. So yeah, when we were there together, I had not been to Tibet at that point. So yeah, I guess that was the beginning of my interest in the area.
Because I still remember, the church in Kasauli, especially, is is a unique piece in itself, and the paintings on the walls, glass, basically the glass walls.
Yeah, the
walls are glass in the background.
Stained glass windows.
Yeah, and the stained glass in the paintings that I saw in Italy, by Leonardo da Vinci, and then the paintings on the glass, almost the same. And the entire church is made of Kasauli sandstone.
Yeah,
and it's a perfect architectural use of the sandstones, and how beautifully you can use the sandstones.
Yeah, I know, it's lovely. I remember that trip very well. So
I think now we should start. And
okay, do you want to give me
no?
share
I think
screen?
he will just Dr. Kishan Kant will just introduce you.
Okay.
And then we can just start. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Arya, for giving me this opportunity to introduce Dr. Robert Spicer with the forum today. Dr. Robert Spicer, first of all, I would like to welcome you to this event, which has been organized by Tethys Fossil Museum, which is supported by Indian Geoparks. Thanks a lot for being here this great day when we are celebrating the World Water Day. And the title of today's talk, The Cenozoic Evolution of As and the Landscape. So that is what we are doing today. And to tell you about Dr. Robert Spicer, all those who are present here, Mr. Vijay Kumar, Sanjay Kumar, James Peters, and others who are here today. And Dr. Spicer, with a first degree in botany and a PhD in geology, both from Imperial College London, has always been interested in the evolution of life on Earth and its mutual interaction with climate. As a Lindemann Research Fellow of the California Academy of Sciences, he spent 3 years with the US Geological Survey at Menlo Park, California, studying the vegetation and climate of the Arctic during the late Cretaceous hothouse world. On his return to the UK, he was appointed to a lecturing post at the University of London before moving to Oxford, where he taught in both earth sciences and plant sciences and was a tutor at St. Hugh's College, as well as being dean. In 1994, he took up a chair and became head of earth sciences at the Open University and then director of the Center for Earth, Planetary Space, and Astronomical Research at the Open University. In 2007, he was awarded the Paleobotanical Society of India International Medal, and in 2019, the Harris Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Paleobotany. Bob has been researching the orogeny of the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayan and the Dhangiari mountains, the development of the Asian monsoon system, and the evolution of the region's extraordinary biodiversity. He has spent a lot of time in India and China, has taken part in 6 field campaigns across Tibet, and is now an emeritus professor at the Open University and a senior visiting scholar at Zhejiang Tropical Botanical Garden, Chinese Academy of Sciences. So, an extensive research that has been done by Dr. Robert Spicer, and we have with us Dr. Ritesh Arya, who we know as a great man who has worked a lot in the field of geology. And today we see that Dr. Saab has been working in the field of geology, and of course, his efforts go a long way in making this successful venture, that is Tethys Fossil Museum, which is coming up in and around Kasauli. You see that in this venture, he has put his life, and this webinar has also been organized by members of Tethys Fossil Museum and Research Center, which is coming at Dhangiari, a small village in Kasauli Tehsil of Indian Himalayas. Geologically, museum is located on the debris concealing the Dagshai Subathu boundary, which signifies closure of Tethys Sea and evolution of terrestrial ecosystem. Museum is built from 20 million year old rocks of Kasauli Sandstone, beautifully chiseled to give museum an aesthetic look. Water which we drink in the museum is from a borewell drilled into 40 million year old white quartzite sandstone, which is marker bed extending from Pakistan to Burma in the least. Tethys Museum will display diverse, well-preserved fossils of Stromatolites Edia Cara, Trilobites, Molluscs, Ammonites, etc. from Spiti Valley, fishes, whales, sharks, oysters, molluscan, foraminera from Subathu and lake. Plant remains consisting of logs of trees, leaves, flowers, roots, etc. from Kasauli and Dharamshala, and mammals from Shivaliks, signifying gradual evolution of life on this planet, and all are part of the museum repository. So anyone visiting the museum will have a glimpse of how different fossils collected from different geological formations across the Himalayas can help to rebuild the entire paleohistory of the various events which led to the evolution and birth of the Himalayas. Tethys, as we all know, was an ocean once upon a time separating India from Tibet and Eurasia. As the Indian plate moved northward, the Tethys Sea squeezed, and when the two plates collided, then the Tethyan sediments were uplifted, forming the mighty Himalaya. Lots of research has been done in timing the collision of the two plates, leading to evolution and birth of the Tethyan Himalayas. But still there is no consensus, and there are Himalayan opportunities for researchers to come up with a convincing model to time the collision and explain the birth of the Himalayas. Keeping this in mind, the organizing committee of Tethys Fossil Museum and Research Center decided to host a series of lectures by veteran geologists who dedicated their lives to understanding this geomechanism. And today's lecture is one such lecture which will be addressed by Dr. Robert Spicer, who, as I have already told, is a great man in the field of geology. So, Dr. Spicer, we welcome you to today's forum, and we would like to hear from you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to, okay, you need to give me permission to share my screen.
Dr. Alex, you could kindly.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing. You need to give me permission.
Yeah, it's okay now.
It's okay now, thank you. Okay, you should see, yeah, I'll go back now. You should see the lead slide, is that correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction. This particular view that you can see here is looking towards India from the Tibetan Plateau, and the mountain you see in front of you is Mount Shishapangma. And I will come back to that a little bit later. So I'm going to tell you some stories of how we have in the last few years, literally the last few years, quantified as best we can the evolution of the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalaya. This is an ongoing story, and it's not something that I've done by myself. As you will appreciate, modern research involves teams of people. And in this case, there is an extremely good team of people from Sichuanbana Tropical Botanical Garden, where I have a joint appointment, and a team of climate modelers at Bristol University. And together we make up a project called Umbrella, Understanding Monsoons and Biodiversity Relevant to Landscapes and Livelihoods in Asia. And this links directly into what you were saying about World Water Day, because the Himalaya Tibet orographic edifice is often referred to as the water tower of Asia. For fairly obvious reasons, the glacial storage of water supplies life-giving water to at least 2 billion people. And so it's highly significant. And understanding how that Earth system works that maintains that water tower, and in fact built the water tower in the first instance, is what the project is all about. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the talk. We often hear or see the phrase, the uplift of the Tibetan Plateau. And I'm going to say right now, this is nonsense. And the reason is Tibet did not rise as a single low relief, that is to say flat entity. It did not rise as a plateau. So there can be no uplift of a plateau. Instead, as we will see, Tibet was built incrementally and in quite complex ways. Sometimes you'll also see the term Qinghai Tibetan Plateau, and it's not just referring to the plateau, it refers also to the Himalaya. lumping the Himalaya in with the Tibetan Plateau from a geological perspective is also nonsense, as I will explain as we go along. So in the talk, I'm going to examine the structure and assembly of this Earth's third pole region. So as well as being a water tower of Asia, the Tibetan Himalaya edifice redirects major streams of air that has effects right across the planet. And of course, being a high and relatively cold region at low latitudes, it also affects global climate. For this reason, it's called the third pole, and it's the highest, largest, and youngest topographic feature on Earth. What we're going to do is we're going to look at isotope data and recently discovered fossils to try and quantify particularly the Paleogene topography and climate of the third pole region, because as we now know, it was in the Paleogene that most of that topography was formed. And then we're going to look at just how reliable those techniques that we've used to quantify the growth of the third pole really are. And we're going to do that by using an extensional basin high in the Western Himalaya called the Zander or Zander Basin as a test case. So what I want to do first is look at some of the older Tibetan plateau growth models. One of the first ones that was proposed proposed by the geophysicist Philip England and Houseman in the 1980s. And being geophysicists, like most physicists, they want to reduce everything down to simple equations. And they treated Tibet like a piece of plastic that was being squeezed by India coming north against the resistance of the Eurasian continent. And as this compression thickened the crust and the mantle lithosphere below, the mantle lithosphere projected down into the hot asthenosphere and over time melted away or was thermally eroded. And once the relatively cold and heavy mantle lithosphere was removed, that allowed the portion of the crust that represents Tibet to rise relatively rapidly upwards, going from approximately 3 kilometers to 5 kilometers at about 10 million years ago. Well, the geologists objected to this, and a paper by Taponnier et al. In 2001 said, look, you can't just treat Tibet like a piece of plastic. It's got lots of deep-rooted geological structures within it that will affect the behavior of the crust as India moves northwards. And in the Taponnier et al. Model, they envisaged the southern part of the Tibetan region rising first in the Eocene and then progressively rising in a northeasterly direction. So the youngest uplift was the northeastern corner, as it were, of the plateau. They also pointed out extrusion out to the east and southeast, but they didn't say much about the Himalaya, but the implication was that the Himalaya were the first part of this system to rise. When people started looking at oxygen isotopes, they found that in southern Tibet and central Tibet, the isotopes suggested quite high elevations in the Eocene. And so this was taken to justify or validate the Taponnier model. And this diagram here, published in Nature, in an overview of the work by Rowley and Curry by Mulch and Chamberlain, suggested that the Himalaya was included in the southern part of what is now the Tibetan Plateau. And that whole system rose at about 40 million years. And like Phil England and Houseman, they ignored deep geological structures like the Yarlung Sangpo suture. So they regarded the Himalaya and southern Tibet as a single entity, despite the fact that there is a big suture there. And more recently, in 2014, Wang Chengshan and others took the isotope paleoaltimetry and suggested a model whereby central Tibet was high that is to say 4.5 kilometers or thereabouts in the Paleogene, and that actually that the Himalaya was a growth that was added in the Neogene to the south, and the Hochschild Basin and all the land to the north of the plateau also rose in the Neogene. So we have a central Proto-Tibetan core plateau in the Paleogene. Well, let's look at what we're actually talking about in very basic terms. We have to the west the Karakoram Fault, providing a boundary to the Tibetan Plateau, to the north the Alting Tar Fault, to the south the Himalaya, and to the east the Hengduan Mountains that ramp down into Yunnan. But if you look at this sort of topographic map of the region, you will see that there are in fact structures within the plateau itself, not only the Yarlong Sangpo Suture relative lowland going through here, but another lowland running through here and others to the north. And what these represent are ancient sutures, sutures where tectonic plates, microplates or terrains impacted Eurasia throughout the Mesozoic. And what we now know happened is that these series of terrains, all of which are derived from Gondwana, began to impact Eurasia in the case of the Hochschild terrain in the Triassic. The Changtang terrain then arrived in the Jurassic. The Lhasa terrain arrived at the end of, or towards the end of the Jurassic and in the early Cretaceous, and subducted beneath the Changtang terrain, just as India today, which arrived at the beginning of the Cenozoic, is subducting beneath the Lhasa terrain. And each one of these collisions formed a suture, and associated with each suture, we have an uplift or buckling, a deformation of the crust. So here in this cross-section produced by Kapp and Dessel in 2019, you can see the Lhasa terrain going beneath the Changtang terrain and the India plate going beneath the Lhasa terrain. Now, of course, all these collisions built this large topographic high, which has profound effects on the direction of air parcel trajectories. So here we have westerlies that are deflected around the third pole. And what they do is that they tend to allow moist air in particular to come over East Asia, forming the East Asia monsoon. And they also, although they interact with moist air coming from the Indian Ocean to form the South Asian monsoon, this large, high piece of crust heats up preferentially in the summer and drags and intensifies these winds coming from the ocean, bringing moisture that supplies the needs of humanity and in fact the whole biosphere across most of Asia. So the question for a long time is what would happen if Tibet wasn't there in terms of monsoon systems, and how did Tibet get to be what it is? Because understanding that will help us understand how monsoon systems work and how resilient they're likely to be in the future under a global warming scenario. Well, let me jump now to what we think we know. We've dealt with some of the older models, but literally in the last 5 years, our views have changed significantly. So what we think happened now is the following. Here we have the Tanggula Mountains, which were formed when the Lhasa terrain collided with the Changtang terrain. To the south of that, we have the Gangdesi uplands, which are like an Andean arc formed when the Neothethian plate that preceded the Indian continental plate subducted beneath Eurasia. So this is a volcanic arc forming a mountain range in the late Cretaceous. And between this Gangdesi highland and the Tanggula highland, we have the remnant of the Mesotethys. And until about 110 million years ago, we have marine sediments being deposited in central Tibet. By the Middle Eocene, roughly 47 million years ago, this marine system has entirely disappeared, and we have a lowland valley that is at an elevation of around 1.5 to 1.7 kilometers. It's approximately, this is a bit of a guesstimate, 200 kilometers wide. It's narrower now because of the compression from India and so on. But we think back in the Middle Eocene that it was a wide, low valley. So this elevation here is about 1.5 kilometers to 1.7 kilometers, whereas the Gangdesi at around 4.5 kilometers, as are the Tangula Mountains. By 29 million years, this lowland had risen to near the present elevation, which is around 4,500 meters. And by the Miocene, we have a near plateau, but the Himalaya are still not very high. Back in the Middle Eocene, the Himalaya are just at around 1 kilometer elevation, building against the southern flank of the Gangdesi. By 15 million years ago, the Himalaya are roughly the same elevation as the Gangdesi, in other words, 4.5 to 5 kilometers high. And of course, now the Himalaya have a mean elevation in excess of 6 kilometers, with peaks going to 8 kilometers, which far exceeds the Gangdesi, which are still at around 4.5 to 5 kilometers. Obviously, there are peaks in there too. And the growth of the Himalaya effectively blocks a lot of moisture getting onto the plateau, which previously, when the Himalaya were lower, didn't form such a blockage. So even as late as the Middle Miocene, we have warm temperate woodland on the plateau, as against the semi-arid grasslands which we see today. So the question you should be asking yourself is, how do we know that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on a very brief tour of just a few of the plant fossil localities that we have across this region. Now, none of this work would have been possible without the help of people in India, notably people at BSIP and also in Calcutta. And between everybody, we've looked at a range of lowland plant fossil localities in the Siwaliks, which we use as our sea level datum, assuming that these were not formed more than around 250 meters above ancient sea level. And we compare those with the kinds of fossil floras we have in central Tibet. And today we're just going to look at the Bangor and Lumpula basins. There are many other basins that I could talk about, but it would take much too long. So first of all, we need to talk about how we actually measure surface heights in the past using paleoaltimeters. Well, I think everybody is probably aware that as you go up a mountainside, and this is a diagram that comes from something published in 1890, from Arizona, as you go up a mountainside, the vegetation changes. And this is because temperature drops as you go high. But temperature drop is not uniform. In the northern hemisphere, on a south-facing slope, that drop in temperature with elevation is less per kilometer than it is on the north-facing slope, on the shadow side, if you like, of the mountain. And so we see changes that vary with changing elevation as we go upslope, changes in the vegetation. Well, this is due to what we call a thermal lapse rate. And there are many different kinds of thermal lapse rates. One of the common ones been used in the past is a free air or environmental lapse rate. And this is simply the change in temperature with elevation, Z, in a column of free air, non-convecting column of air. And that gives you this environmental lapse rate, which on a global basis is approximately 6.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer. This is all very well if you're an airline pilot, for example. It's quite useful. but not if you want to use geological proxies like fossil leaves or isotopes that are formed in lakes and soils to derive elevations, because they're not in a column of free air. They're on a land surface. And a land surface lapse rate or terrestrial lapse rate is very different. For a start, in most cases, the rate of temperature decline is less than it is in a column of free air. And typically on a global basis, it's only 5.5 degrees Celsius today versus 6.5 for the free air lapse rate. Now, the problem with all of this is, of course, as we saw from the first diagram, that this 5.5 is not to be taken or used uniformly, because on a south-facing slope, it might be 4.5, and on a north-facing slope in the Northern Hemisphere, it may be 6.5. It varies with aspect. It also varies with elevation, as you saw with the first diagram, and it also varies with latitude. So this number here, which is very often used in the literature to convert paleo temperatures into elevations, is extremely unreliable. So here we have our diagram again, our first diagram showing the changes in rates from the two sides of the mountain system. Not only does the terrestrial lapse rate vary with aspect and location and elevation, you can't really use modern environmental or terrestrial thermal lapse rates, because the lapse rates depend on atmospheric composition. And we know this has changed through time, changes in atmospheric CO2, changes in moisture in the atmosphere, depending on what the temperature of the atmosphere is, etc. So you can't use these numbers here to determine what's going on in the past. So when a lapse rate is normally measured, it's measured using a conventional ordinary dry bulb thermometer. So we're all used to dry bulb thermometers, no problem. But last year, Alex Farnsworth, who's part of our team, and a number of us in the group, we decided to try and explore these spatial variations in lapse rates. And what you see in this diagram is a number of black dots and pink dots and orange dots and so on. And what these are dry bulb lapse rates, terrestrial lapse rates, as determined in a climate model. Now, in this particular exercise, what we're trying to do is we're trying to see how good these thermal lapse rates are at predicting a particular topography which we have given to the model. So in this rather complicated diagram, you can see that there's a red star down here. And in a nutshell, the closer these points are to the red star, the better these particular lapse rates are at predicting the topography which we have prescribed within the model. So basically, you can see that all of these over here are really appallingly bad at trying to reproduce the topography in the model. And these are all either annual or summer or autumn or winter lapse rates, dry bulb lapse rates, absolutely useless. The mean annual ones, which are the normal ones used, are the black ones. The green ones over here, they get closer to our reference star, and they're spring dry bulb lapse rates. So there's some hope there. But if we use a wet bulb thermometer, and that's a normal thermometer with a wet wick around it, the evaporation of water from the wick into the relatively dry air around the thermometer cools the bulb of the thermometer, and so the temperature is lower. So in unsaturated air, wet bulb temperatures are lower than dry bulb. when the air is saturated, they're the same. And what you can see here is a whole cluster of open squares very close to the star. And these open squares are not only our annual, but also our seasonal wet bulb terrestrial lapse rates. And they are all very good. It doesn't matter what season you're in, they're very good at reproducing the topography in the model. And the reason for this is that as a parcel of air traverses up and over a mountain, it rises. As it rises, it cools. And of course, the relative humidity changes. It tends to go higher. So temperature and humidity are intrinsically linked. And this is reflected in wet bulb temperatures. Now, how do we get wet bulb temperatures for the past? Well, if you could think about it, a leaf acts as a wet bulb temperature. It's constantly losing moisture to the atmosphere through evaporation or evapotranspiration. And so the leaf is cooler than the surrounding atmosphere is. So when we look at leaf traits using a multivariate statistical technique called CLAMP, and there is the website if you want to know more about it. I don't have time to go into the technique right now. When you put these leaf traits into a CLAMP analysis, you find that there's a very strong correlation between leaf traits and wet bulb annual mean temperatures. And here is the regression line. So if we can go to a fossil assemblage and look at the traits that we see in the leaves in that assemblage and convert those traits to wet bulb temperatures, we have a method whereby we can accurately predict past surface height. We can also determine temperatures using isotopes. And in this case, we're going to look at clumped isotopes. Now, what is a clumped isotope? Well, basically, a clumped isotope is, in this particular context, it's the composition, isotopic composition of carbon dioxide, CO2, with a mass of 47 when it's released from a carbonate dissolved in phosphoric acid. And what you're looking at is the substitution of carbon 13 for carbon 12 and oxygen 18 for oxygen 16. And the amount in which these substitutions take place is directly temperature dependent. So if you can measure these isotopic ratios in a carbonate, you can use a formula to get back to the formation temperature of that carbonate, and you convert that carbonate formation temperature into a wet bulb temperature using a thing called the Davies-Jones formulation. We can also measure elevation using conservation of energy principles. Now, in this particular instance, as a parcel of air rises over a mountain range, its moist static energy is conserved. Moist static energy is made up of moist enthalpy, which itself is a combination of temperature and moisture, and potential energy, which is the product of height times the gravitational constant. So basically, because we know G stays the same through time, and we know that overall the moist static energy stays the same, if we increase the potential energy, then the moist enthalpy must go down. So if we can measure moist enthalpy at a low elevation, let's say sea level, and we can measure it at a high elevation, what we're trying to find, and subtract those two and divide them by acceleration due to gravity, we can get the height difference. And again, leaves, because moist enthalpy is a function of temperature and moisture, two things that plants are very interested in, what we find is that leaves code extremely well for mean annual moist enthalpy. And there is the regression line for that. So again, we can derive moist enthalpy from fossil leaves. And lastly, another paleoaltimeter that's been used is isotope fractionation. Now, this is different to clumped isotopes because what we're talking about here is differential fractionation of heavy isotopes and light isotopes. So let's suppose we have moisture in a parcel of air, and that moisture has the water is made up of both heavy and light isotopes of oxygen and hydrogen. When that moisture condenses in the parcel of air and falls out as rain, the heavy isotopes preferentially condense out first. So what we end up with is the rain is isotopically heavier than the moisture, than the air parcel that it left. So as an air parcel rises up against the mountain slope and rains out moisture, that air parcel becomes progressively isotopically lighter. And here is an isotopic lapse rate showing the change in isotopic composition with elevation. So if we can capture the isotopic ratio of rainwater in a carrier material, sort of typically might be organic matter or it might be carbonate, and we can preserve that through time against all kinds of diagenetic changes and so on, and we know what the isotopic composition was at the start of that air parcel trajectory, sea level, then we can calculate the elevation of our carbonates at height. The problem with this, though, is that as an air parcel travels over a topographically complex land surface, such as Tibet, there are multiple evaporation and precipitation events, all of which will change the isotopic ratios. Now, typically in isotope paleoaltimetry, people use what Hoke has called educated guesses to compensate for this. But these days we can use isotope-enabled climate models, which are far more rigorous. So let's examine what would happen in our Gangdesi Changtang Central Tibetan Valley system with a monsoon climate. In the summer, we have wet air coming from the Neo-Tethys, rising up against the Gangdesi because we haven't built the Himalaya yet, and we get progressive depletion of the heavy isotopes so that the air passing into the valley is enriched in light isotopes. In the winter, we get a reversal of the airflow, and so we get the same sort of thing happening over the Changtang mountain range. Again, filtering our air parcel in favor of light isotopes. So whatever is ending up in the valley and going through let's say a water cycle within the valley will only have light isotopes, and the isotopic composition will reflect the crest heights of the two bounding mountain systems. And so it doesn't matter where you find your carbonates. Let's suppose you find them in the lake down here in the middle of the valley, you will still get an elevation which is that of the Gangdesi or the Changtang mountain crests. So inevitably you end up with a phantom plateau. And we can test this in a climate model. Here is a climate model with a valley in Tibet. Here's one with a plateau in Tibet. And if you look at the isotopic signatures, you can't really see any difference between the two. So this is why all the isotopes we get from central Tibet point to there being a plateau, a high plateau in the Paleogene. However, when we go to the central Tibetan plateau and we start digging in Eocene sediments, we find fossils. And these fossils tell a very different story. So here we're going to the Bangor Basin along the Bangong Newjang Suture here in central Tibet. There's the Bangor Basin. And we have a series of plant fossil localities, and their age is determined to be Middle Eocene using UPB dating. And this is the assemblage that we find. And amongst them, we find this, what we call a rabbit ear kind of seed that looks like a small dipterocarp. You can think of it in terms of a small dipterocarp, although we don't actually know what it is. But what we do know is that we find the Tibetan form also in the North American Middle Eocene Green River Formation and the Middle Eocene Messel deposits in Germany. So this particular plant, whatever it was widespread in the Northern Hemisphere in the Middle Eocene. Here are some other illustrations of some of the plant fossils that we get, including this Ailanthus, which is one of the very, very few plant fossils that have an Indian connection. Most of the plant fossils are strictly non-Gondwanan in their affinities. Well, we can look at the Bangor Basin leaf flora, and if we do a clamp analysis on it, we find it's monsoonal. It has a wet season, dry season precipitation ratio of around 6:1, which is just monsoonal. It's weakly monsoonal. It's subtropical with a mean annual temperature of 19 degrees, warm month mean up near 30, with a cold month mean of 7, which suggests, given the uncertainties, that we may have had very rare but occasional frosts. And it was quite humid. There's a lot of moisture in this valley system. But the VPD, the seasonal VPDs, vapor pressure deficits, suggest a wet winter and a dry summer, quite unlike the modern South Asian monsoon. But critically, when we use the moist enthalpy conservation of energy method for getting elevation, we find it was an elevation of around 1.5 kilometers plus or minus 0.9, which is a long way lower than the present elevation of nearly 5 kilometers. So we published in 2020 a paper in PNAS and referred to this as a Shangri-La Valley, taking the inspiration from the Lost Horizon novel published in the 1930s. And what we see here is a reconstruction done by Alex Boersma, showing our central Tibetan valley with a little summer rain shower and our highly diverse tropical system. If we now move to the Lunpula Basin, which is adjacent to Bangor, and start digging there, we find palm leaves. And we published a paper in Science Advances in 2020. And at that time, we thought these palm leaves were 25 million years old, but we now know from new UPB dates in the section that they're actually 38 million years old. And if we look at a thermal lapse rate approach, we can work out what the maximum elevation is of the valley that would allow palms to live. And we can do that because palms are temperature sensitive, particularly as seedlings. And we know that natural populations of palms cannot survive where the mean cold month or the cold month mean temperature is below 5.2 degrees Celsius. And using a 38 million year old terrestrial lapse rate that we can obtain from our climate model, we end up with an elevation of 2.8 kilometers. So between 47 million years and 38 million years, the plants are suggesting an elevational rise of 1.5 kilometers to an elevation that is somewhere below 2.8. All we can derive from the palm is a maximum possible elevation. When we look at the leaf flora as a whole for that same locality, here's Ailanthus again with our Indian connection. When we look at the leaf assemblage as a whole and use moist enthalpy, that gives us an elevation of 2.6 kilometers, which of course is below our 2.8 maximum given by the palm. So we can assume here that we get an elevational change of 1.5 to 2.6 between 47 and 38 million years ago in central Tibet. Along with the plants, we find things like water striders, which are typically low elevation, and this thing, which is called a climbing perch, which actually is a fish that breathes breathes air, and as a consequence cannot live in lake systems where the surface of the lake is frozen at any point in the year. What is also interesting is that these leaves and insects and everything are all in oil shales. So actually the Lumpula and Bangor basins are potential oil producing areas where we have the high organic productivity in these lake systems in central Tibet, converting now to hydrocarbons. We can also obtain temperatures using clumped isotopes from these same locations. And this is an example from the Lumpula Basin. The assumption has been that the soil carbonates formed in the summer, but actually this is not necessarily the case. All we need is a warm enough temperature for the chemistry to take place. But what's critical is that the soil has to be drying, but not totally dry. So as the soil dries, the carbonates get precipitated. So what we've had to do here is we've again used our climate model to look at the soil moisture at the depth in the soil profile where the carbonates are normally sampled, which is around 40 centimeters in the Paleosol. And so we can tell here that between April and October in the Lutetian, Middle Eocene, we have declining moisture content. So the soil is drying. So potentially we could form carbonates anywhere in this window. What we also need to look at is the precipitation evaporation ratio. And we're only losing water critically at the surface between February and June. That restricts it a bit more. And from June onwards, we have a little bit of summer rain. And from October through to the end of December is when our wet season is. So this allows us to constrain times of the year when the conditions are right for carbonate precipitation. So the temperatures we get from the carbonate are specific to these particular times in the year, not necessarily just the summer. In our model, we can produce all different kinds of topographic scenarios. So here we had a Lutetian valley. We can have a Lutetian plateau at 4.5 kilometers. We can go a little bit younger into the Chattian and have a valley and a plateau. And we can test our observed clumped isotopes against what the model is saying the temperature should be. And we find only a certain number of matches. And when we look at that, we find that the only conditions which allow us to give or have a model predicted climate that matches the isotope temperatures is when we have a Lutetian valley and a Chattian plateau. And the Lutetian valley is at 1.7 kilometers for these samples between 50 and 40 million years ago. And when we move to a plateau, the isotopes give us an elevation of 4 kilometers or above. Again, this pattern matches very well what we're getting from the leaves and shows that we have a significant rise of central Tibet between 40 million years. And by 29 million years, we have already established the plateau, as I showed you in the cartoons earlier. So what we've got here is a summary of what we now believe to be the case for the different parts of Tibetan Himalayan system being built at different times. So way back at the beginning of the Cenozoic, the Gangdesi are already high and they remain high all the way through to the present day. The next part of the third pole to be built is the Hengduan Mountains, and they rise between 50 and by 40 million years, they're pretty much in the sort of form that we have today. And when we look at molecular phylogeny, we find the earliest origins of alpine taxa occur in the Hengduan Mountains. So the molecular phylogeny and the geology are very similar, and we published that in Science last year. The next part of Tibetan system to reach its modern elevations is central Tibet, as I've just gone through. Then we have northern Tibet rising to its present elevations. But the last part of the third pole to build are the Himalaya. And they, all through the Paleogene, are relatively low. only achieving roughly 2 kilometers by 23 million years, but then they shoot up so that by 19 million years, they're already exceeding 5 kilometers. And of course, they continue up to today. So the building of the Tibetan plateau was not a case of an uplift of a plateau, but it was the differential rise of lots of bits of the plateau at different times. But how do we know this paleoaltimetry is correct? Well, we have a particular basin, a very young basin called the Zander Basin here in the northwestern Himalaya. It sits just south of the Yarlung Sangpo Suture at a present elevation of around 4,250 meters. The deposits were accumulated in the Zander Basin in the late Miocene through to Pleistocene, with some leaf fossil assemblages here in the Pliocene at 3.5. So we've got fossil horses, and we have pollen also from different parts of this section. And the dating is all correlated across the basin using magnetostratigraphy. The fossil flora that we have there is mostly composed of small leaves, much as the present day vegetation is within the Zander Basin. These are all adapted to relatively cool and relatively dry environments. There are no conifers and there are no large wind-pollinated plants of any great abundance within the leaf flora. What we do, however, notice, just to give you a context, is that when we look at the pollen flora is dominated by wind-pollinated taxa, in particular conifers like Picea, Pinus, Tsuga, etc., which we don't see in the leaf fossils. And what we can do is we can use our dry bulb lapse rates and apply them to pollen or leaves. We can apply wet bulb lapse rates, or we can use enthalpy and isotopes. So let's just look at this for the moment. The light green shading here represents the results that Wu et al. Produced in 2014 using nearest living relative techniques, coexistence approach on fossil pollen. And what they got was a very low elevation. They said no higher than 3.6 kilometers for the Zander Basin 3 million years ago. Remember, today it's over 4 kilometers. Now, the problem that they had with this is that they calibrated their pollen elevation using elevation zones in eastern Tibet. And although there are no conifers around in the Zander Basin today, and there are no conifers preserved in the Zander Basin Pliocene leaf fossil assemblage, they assumed that the conifers were growing around the Zander Basin. What in fact is happening is the wind-pollinated conifers, the pollen is being wafted up the southern flank of the Himalaya by the monsoon north-flowing winds, carried over the Himalaya and dumped into the basin. So a lot of the taxa they find in the pollen flora represent lower elevation vegetation growing on the windward side of the Himalaya, not what was growing around the basin itself. If you apply global mean dry bulb lapse rates, shown here by the red circles, to the leaf flora, you also get very low elevations. If you apply a model wet bulb lapse rate, but a dry bulb temperature obtained from the leaf flora, again, you get low elevations. Where you do get interesting results that are very similar to the modern elevation is when you use clamp using either thermal lapse rates or nearest living relative coexistence temperatures based on leaves. And Huang et al. In 2020 obtained these sorts of elevations in the blue band here. the blue and green dots that you can see here are all elevations derived from wet bulb temperatures of the Zander Basin and the lowland Siwaliks, and using a model-derived wet bulb lapse rate. And there you get temperatures which are, elevations which are very similar to the modern, which is more realistic given the young nature of the basin itself. When we look at the isotopes, we tend to get very high elevations, as shown by the pink shading here, elevations above 5 kilometers. And remember what I said earlier on, that the isotopic signature is the signature of the mountain crests that the air parcel has to pass over before the rain falls into the basin itself. So these isotope elevations are all biased towards the Himalayan crest and the Gandhisi crest rather than the elevation of the basin floor itself. Interestingly, moist enthalpy values are also in this same bracket, and we do not really understand why, because they should not. So we can discount the pollen analysis and the dry bulb approach. The wet bulb approach seems reasonable, and the isotopes seem to be giving us crest heights, which is fine. And if we use these together, we can get some idea of the ancient relief. But when it comes to the moist enthalpy, that's a bit puzzling. Now, when you use moist enthalpy in a model, and here is, you can see here, this is mean sea level moist enthalpy minus the topographic height moist enthalpy, and we put a valley in Tibet, we can see that valley. And when we make Tibet a plateau, we can see that plateau. So we know that moist enthalpy is tracking paleotopography extremely well, much better than isotopes do. But what I decided to do during our COVID lockdown in the UK was to look at a series of Google Earth transects going from lowland Siwalik sites all the way up to the Himalayan crest, typically around 5 kilometers, which is the sort of range we're talking about here. And looking at gridded moist enthalpy values for each one of these sites and gridded moist enthalpy values for elevation, dividing those differences by little g. And what we find is that uniformly, this approach to measuring elevation overestimates the observed height. So here are the observed heights at each one of these locations, height difference between the Siwalik and the mountain crests. They're all between 4 and just over 5 kilometers. But our moist enthalpy derived elevations are roughly 1 kilometer higher all the way through. So there is a systematic estimation of elevation using this approach. And we need to do a lot more climate modeling work to try and understand why. And very lastly, I want to take you to some very recent work being done on Mount Sheshupangma. I introduced you to this earlier on. And back in 1973, Zhu et al. Reported some Quercus semicarpifolia, some oak leaves, at an elevation above 5,000 meters on the 8,000 meter high Mount Sheshupangma. But Zhu et al. Didn't know exactly where they came from. They were just found as loose blocks, and they had no idea of age. They assumed they were Pliocene. And this led to a lot of stuff in the Chinese literature about Tibet rising suddenly in the Pliocene, which is complete nonsense. But last year, my colleagues at Sichuanbana decided to go back onto Mount Sheshupangma, and just below 6,000 meters, they discovered these oak leaves. And we now know from very recent dating that they cannot be older than 16 million years. So they're middle Miocene or younger, but we still don't know the exact date yet until we get more dating results back. So there is still a lot more to do in the Himalaya in terms of tracking its uplift, and plant fossils are a possible way of doing that. Some takeaway thoughts. Plant fossils, isotopes, and climate modeling are changing our ideas of Tibetan landscape evolution. This evolution, we now know, was complicated. And this reveals deep geological processes that include not just crustal thickening, but also in places thermal delamination. It's just that the thermal delamination doesn't apply across the whole plateau uniformly. This complexity with the Paleogean Central Valley has got to be incorporated into any realistic climate modeling, including modeling of the evolution of monsoon systems in Asia. Model data iteration does and can lead to much better understanding of monsoon dynamics through time, but we have to get the elevations correct. We then put those elevations into a model. We then refine our lapse rates, and iteratively, we can get to a much better solution for the unique growth dynamics of the plateau region and the Himalaya. Isotope and fossil-based paleoaltimetric proxies are complementary. Isotopes tend to give you the highs. Fossil-based paleoaltimeters give you the valley bottoms. Isotope fractionations are biased towards the mountain crests, but in a valley system like we had in central Tibet, that can give you a false or phantom plateau. And fossil pollen paleoaltimetric proxies are really highly problematic due to the fact that pollen can be transported upslope, downslope, reworked, etc., and you have no idea where it came from. And so I would argue that pollen-based paleoaltimetric estimates are extremely unreliable. However, fossil leaf proxies, and because fossil leaves can't be transported far from where they were growing and still remain in a recognizable state, combined with wet bulb lapse rates, do give you, appear to give you very reliable outcomes. And of course, moist enthalpy is a possibility as well. So a big thank you to everyone on the team, including all those lovely people in Tibet who helped us over the years. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, Dr. Arya, if you think like saying anything about today's presentation by Dr. Robert Spicer, of course, it was an extensive one and very wonderfully given, along with all the details and the data that are required for such a wonderful presentation. The Sensoic evolution of Himalayas and the landscape, of course, very well described by Dr. Robert Spicer. And of course, Tethys is beholden. We are thankful to you for this wonderful presentation. Dr. Arya, what would you say?
Thank you, Professor Spicer. It has been wonderful listening to you. I must appreciate your work, which you have done in the Tibetan Himalayas, the Tibetan part. The way you have shown your first few slides are very interesting, you know. The progression from Cretaceous, Eocene, Oligocene, Pliocene, the entire sequence as it goes northwards, you know, various models which you have shown. Can you just show the first few slides?
Yeah, I can go back.
Yeah, maybe. So these so these reminds me of, you know, I had been working on fossils for now almost like 35 years, collecting fossils, not, so no, maybe earlier slides also. Earlier ones. Yeah. So maybe because that is basically the progression which you have shown is from the north of the Ladakh batholith, you know, or maybe I should say the Changthang region, you know. So these, no, maybe the formation of the model earlier slides, you know. Yeah, this one is good enough. Okay. Maybe this one or the other one, you know. Yeah. No, maybe earlier one. So that
earlier one still.
Yeah. These are good enough. So now you see the Himalayas, they have not shown much, but across the Indus-Sanko-Sucha zone, the Eocene Tibet, then we have the Oligocene Tibet and the Quaternary Tibet, very well demarcated. And I must say that when we were working in Ladakh, then south of Ladakh batholith, we see the almost reverse sequence here, you know. On the southern part of the Sucha zone, we find the Eocene sequence, which is almost equivalent to Subathus. And we got a lot of oysters, we got a lot of molluscs in Neoma formation and also in Kargil, which were equivalent to Subathu and Kasauli formations. And a similar type of progression we can see in the Molluscs, you know. So if we see 40 millions, 30 millions, 20 millions, and then this is Ladakh batholith, then in the Himalayan side, it will be like 40 million years, 30 million years, 20 million years south of it. So the Indus Mollusc sequence is almost like, so this almost here, you know, in Ladakh part. And this is quite interesting, you know, the Ladakh batholith, how it played an important role in delimiting the two basins, and the flora and fauna, which we see that you have shown that most of the flora is has affinities to northern hemisphere, or maybe the North American part, or maybe northern land of the Tibet. But in the Himalayan part, we get if I talk about Kasauli, as we have already discussed. So in Kasauli, I have been working for the last since 1987, and you visited that place in 1991 or 92 when you visited Kasauli. We have been collecting fossils, but the remarkable thing about those fossils was that about 6-7 species which we got, the megafloral species I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the pollens. Pollens earlier used to give that feeling of you can say marine near coastal environment, but again, as you rightly said, that pollens cannot be relied upon, you know, for any altimetry. So
in paleoaltimetry, and unless I mean, there are some exceptions. If you, for example, go to the Siwaliks and you find a lot of pollen that are at mangrove, for example, then or even better still, megafossils, then that is very useful for saying there is a strong indication that we are near sea level. But when it comes to mountain crests and prevailing wind directions and so on, then upslope and downslope movement of pollen means that you get a very blurry picture of the elevation of the source material. But you were saying in the, you know, the western Himalaya part and Ladakh and etc. One of the major questions that is still unresolved is, when did we get the loss of the ocean between the Indian continent and Eurasia? The last little marine puddles, as it were, it was a middle 50 million years, 55 million years, this kind of thing, in the central region around here. What is very interesting is the diversity of views on which part of India collided first. Was it on the western side? Was it on the eastern side? On the western side, you have the Ladakh-Kohistan arc included in this system. And we need a lot more work being done to try and get a much clearer idea of the collision dynamics. Because if we're going to use things like isotopes to try and understand the elevation, we need to know what the isotopic composition was of the air parcel when it started its rise. And if we've got an open seaway through here, we know again from modeling that the isotopic composition of the ocean there is going to be very, very different to if we have little isolated marine embayments and stuff along there, or if we actually have forest down here. It's really a big question. And we need a lot more work done along the Siwaliks, the Himalayan front, up into the Himalaya. Obviously, there are issues about access to some parts of the high Himalaya being close to the international border, and also over here. But the more work that is being done to retrieve fossils and isotopes from this system, the better our sort of ability to reconstruct the past landscape and understand monsoon evolution becomes.
Yeah. So I was just talking about my Kasauli collection. So we got about 6-7 mega floral species. 1894, Medlicott had discovered few the palm leaves, and after that, the species which we have discovered, as I have already told you, that there were about 6 species: Garcinia, Gluta, Combetum, and Syzygium species. Today, they are nowhere found in Himalayas, and they are confined to Indo-Malayan region. So they are confined to Andaman Nicobar. They are confined to Malaysia or Indonesia. And these fossil flora, if we are finding those in Kasaulis, and Kasaulis are almost equivalent to Ladakh, maybe homotextual basins, then probably at the time of deposition of these sediments based on plant fossils, we proposed a model that these were deposited near the equator at that time. So 20 million years, the Kasauli sediments were deposited near the equator, and the Ladakh extension was unfolded and going towards Chitravata and towards Pakistan. And that type of scenario, and the Tethys Sea, which we call the Tethys Sea, was between this Kasauli Subathu, Dagshai Kasauli sediments near the equator, and the sea further ahead of it, sandwiched between the formations which we are showing, like about this the Eocene Tibet and Oligocene Tibet, and these were further north, and maybe they have nothing to do with with these formations, They were developing independently, and the Kasauli, Dagshai, Subathu, and the Ladakh, Kargil, this entire Malish, Dharamshala, Udhampur, all they were depositing near the equator. And this sea, which we call Tethys, which is a confusion that the entire ocean, which maybe this was an ocean, but this was between. So this type of modeling is actually taking a lot of my time, and I'm proposing something like this Kasauli, Dagshai, Subathu being near the equator, and then when India moves, they were already there, And this collision happened between Indian plate and the Subathu Dagshai sediments, and then this entire thing moved together from here, and they moved to, further ahead, And 20 million years, or maybe this is 20 million years, but if Shivaliks are also to be taken here, then the time frames goes to about 5 million years, or maybe less. Then also this is near equator, but that evidences we have to gather, and then this entire thing moves further north. And the thing which you have shown about Tibetan Plateau, that was developing independently, and very rightly, we have no similarity with Indian flora, and they have more similarity with the Eurasian, with the Europe or North American, or maybe the northern part.
Yeah.
So that type of equation now almost suits, So the collision, based on maybe isotopes, someone has suggested isotopes, or that they have suggested the collision to be taking place around 60 million years, someone 50 million years, 40 million years. Last they say about 30 million years, but no one goes beyond 20 million years, 28 million years.
No, they assume everything is all over and done with by then.
Yeah. So, but the fossil evidences say that still Kasauli sediments and Shivaliks may be very much near the equator, and this transition has to move, and then this transition has to move, and the entire thing has to move further ahead, and then modeling of this type makes the Himalayan story very interesting, and this is the basis of me getting interested in all this Himalayan Tethys Fossil Museum, because the model, when we want to place the fossils, the chronology doesn't work. the way the models have been proposed earlier.
Mm.
So maybe great thought has been given now, and now what I want to propose is something like this, and with seeing your this diagram, I think with this picture, it gives a very, very simplistic this Mulch and Cambrian and Rowley and Curie, they have, I think, and this all these models already have given a very, very simplistic view of how the Himalayan part could be in near future. And maybe if we get, we are trying to work with Gaurav. He's planning to come somewhere in from BSIP, and he also you mentioned about clamp and all. He told me once that he's also interested in doing these clamp studies.
Yeah, I think Gaurav is there, I think, listening.
He's joined, Okay. So he wanted to do this from the fossils which we have collected from. I have a huge collection of fossils from Kasauli, so he's quite interested in doing that clamp study. But he wanted number of fossils. I don't know how much because I have been transporting these fossils from one place to another, giving it to one museum to another, so that they could actually display it in a fashion that fossils become more popular and fossils become more popular. But no museum took up this challenge. So we decided to make our own museum and then study. And then Gaurav and this BSIP team, they're planning something. So maybe with this type of modeling, which we have already done in the Lhasa Tibetan part, we may come up with some joint ventures and then do some extensive work in the fossils which we already know from. We have been working with Dr. Ravasti Guleria and Rashmi Shrivastava madam for so many years, and a lot of fossils have been reported. And then with this team of young paleobotanists from BSIP, so maybe we come up with this type of modeling which we have already done in Tibet, and just see how these fossils, the plant fossils, tell a great story about the paleo latitudinal position and paleo altitudinal position also. So paleo latitude is very significant because in 1994 we have already published that these show great similarities. Professor Dr. Avasti was there, and we did a lot of studies in FRI, field research laboratory institutes in Dehradun, comparative studies of the leaves, and we concluded that these were very important. So if now this clamp studies can be carried out with the help of BSIP, I think we may get very interesting results.
Yeah. Well, I say what I tell the Chinese colleagues is keep digging, because we need the fossils. The more, the better.
Yeah. So, Gaurav, you have anything to say?
I can say that that you have said that Kasauli was near the equator. So, which tectonic model you are using to say this that Kasauli was near the equator? Because I am using the Scottish. I'm using the Scottish model.
Which you are using?
What tectonic model you are using to say that Kasauli was near the equator?
So I'm making that model. You'll come to know very soon. We are just building that model now on the basis of the evidence which we got, on the basis of the fossil evidence, not only plant fossils but also on the basis of oysters, bivalves, and sediments which we are getting from the Subathu, and also in Ladakh, Neoma, Kargil, whatever fossils which we have got. So we are trying to compare all these things, and there have been published reports from Kalakot also about the Eocene. So the entire thing which we are trying to do is we are trying to work a model. I'm not working on anybody's model. It is not like that. I am making a model which will tell this story based on the fossils which we have got for the last 30 years across the Himalayas. So maybe in near future, we are not working on anybody's model. Let me be very clear. We are making our own model, and that will be based on So that is not based on any isotopic studies, but that will be based on the fossils and the lithological constraints, the lithostratigraphic constraint and the biostratigraphic constraints. That is what we are planning to work. Yeah. So, do we have any questions?
No, I don't. At the moment, I don't have any question because I really missed the time and I joined very in the last. So
No problem. We will be sending this on YouTube, and if you have any questions, you are free to you can listen to that, and then maybe we can have a premiere of it, and then we can ask Robert Spicer to answer all these questions.
Well, Gaurav, I know, has got one question about what I'm doing with some of his Miocene stuff, but I've been very busy recently, Gaurav. I'm sorry.
I understand, Bob. I understand. No problem. No problem. It's okay. I really understand. But really, I'm very glad to see you again here because it's a very nice platform to discuss all these things very easily. So, and I'm really very happy because we are working mainly on the nowadays we are working on the Shivaliks, and maybe in near future we will get many more fossil localities.
Yay!
Yeah, yes, sir, yeah. Because,
Yeah, there is no dearth of fossils, you know. In Himalayas, there is no dearth of fossils. Only dearth is you need to have patience to find, you know. After meddling,
yeah.
you know, you can't just sit and relax, you know, just and I think in Ladakh also we got very, very interesting fossils over the years,
Yes.
and maybe it's just matter of time. We actually my interest at that time was finding water for the army and the civil population, and wherever I used to go, I used to find time to collect fossils because that never died out, you know. And when I used to collect fossils, it was like wow. But again, the taxonomic point of view, I was always dependent on BSIP for taxonomy. So taxonomy, I was good at, and then and doing the entire story, we can do it together. Maybe I had very good relationship with Avasti sir and the earlier fellows. Then maybe now Gaurav and all, we can just continue with that. Let's see.
Yes,
So it was nice talking
even
to you, Spicer, and I hope you also enjoyed giving the lecture. But we would like to be in touch with you again, and keep this. And you rightly mentioned that from the Carboniferous shales of they are looking in Tibetan Plateau for discovering oil in some of the basins, you know. And I think similar basins we can find in if we can find in the Himalayan part, then it will be very good, because if we can find something in Tibetan part, now I think that we don't have to compare anything what we get in Tibet with the Himalayan parts, because they are going to be entirely different identities. And the Ladakh batholith plays a major important role in dividing the two, and there is no fun in finding any similarity. But yes, contemporary vegetation grows everywhere in the same latitude or different. So maybe we have those basins here in the Himalayas, and then ONGC has been trying a lot hard to find a breakthrough in getting one of the oil wells but they have not been success, but they have tried a lot. And I have been associated with one of their projects, which they drilled about 5 kilometers well in Kasauli. So, but I was finding water for them again. But I monitored the entire section, because whenever I used to go, I used to see that entire 5 kilometers being drilled, and then lucky they were not. That was not good luck. And then in Shivaliks also in they were doing great drilling works, but not much success. But I think with paleontological evidences coming up, more fossils being discovered, and better understanding of the basin, we may get some not only about it's not only about finding the technology, but how we can use the knowledge to explore oil reserve or explore oil in the Himalayas. You know, it is there, but now where has it transported? Where has it moved in the basin because of the tectonics?
Yeah.
And, yeah,
Might have
that
leaked
could be very,
away.
yeah. So that is another question. We have good oil fields in the eastern part of India, but unfortunately, we are not getting any oil in the western part. So that is another challenge which I think not only we face, but ONGC is also facing, you know, and they're trying good. So I think James Peter, if you want to have some questions, you have. Can you hear me?
Yes. No, I don't have any questions. But one of my comments is what Dr. Spicer's in his presentation, he's correlated things very well. From our side, from the Indian side, I don't think we're doing isotope studies, to the extent that is required. I don't know really. I don't know if BSIP is doing it. But this sort of thing is going to help really. If you try to correlate your paleobotany or your fossils, your plant fossils, your spores, pollens, or whatever, with the isotopes. Yeah,
They all tell a different story. So you need to look at all the different aspects together if you can. I mean, BSIP now has moved away from just being paleobotany to be paleosciences. So we have great expectations of a whole new array of techniques, including isotopes. So Gaurav, are you going to start working on isotopes, or are you going to stick to leaves?
Let him stick to leaves, but I think they have a division which will work on the radioactivity. Let him do what he. I think getting into that will be another domain. He has to. What do you say, Gaurav, about that?
Presently, I'm taking help from my colleague who is working on the carbon isotopes, but we are working on the Eocene sediments, not on the Miocene. So maybe in near future we will have some good results. We will combine our mega fossil result and the carbon isotope results, and very surprising, they are giving very similar results. So maybe near future we will publish some good papers combining the isotope and the mega fossil. But only I'm trying on the Eocene.
So Eocene, you're working on Eocene. You're working on the leaves or what you are working on Eocene?
I'm combining the results of isotopes and the mega fossil.
And
Mega fossils.
And mega fossils. So Eocene, where have you find some mega fossils?
We have plenty of not. I think from Western India we have very good exposures of Eocene.
No, but I'll be interested. You'll be interested to listen that we recently found very good fossilized wood, organic fossilized wood from the Eocene sediments.
Oh, from where?
From Subathu Formation. Okay. These are very much these fossilized woods are in association with the oysters, a huge chunk of oysters, and we have this organic fossilized wood in the same rock, So maybe that is quite interesting, and that is, I think, so quite interesting findings we have, and we are going to display it in the museum which we are making. So that's the ongoing process. But yes, we can once it is done, then we can just share those specimens, and if you're interested, we can just work on those specimens, because they are going to be the first report of Oligocene woods from the western part of India, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have to go. It's
yes, I think we have had a very interesting talk, and then we can just conclude this session. And Dr. Kishan Kant, can you just?
Yeah, of course, a very interesting session, and this discussion, of course, added a lot to that. I hope that Dr. Spicer enjoyed a lot being here today, and in future as well, we would love him to be a part of our discussions whenever Tethys takes an initiative and conducts more such workshops, more such talks, where people like Gaurav, people like Dr. Ritesh himself, Robert Spicer, and other people who are here. I can see James Peters is there, and Rajiv Patnaik is also there. So whenever this group of people who are interested in talking about fossils, talking about other things around, and the various layers of this Tibetan part of the peninsula and other things are there, those people who have extensive knowledge and research who have done about these things, whenever they want to share, I hope that Dr. Arya would certainly arrange more such sessions under the banner of Tethys. And this has been a wonderful session. Thanks a lot, all of you, for being here today. And hopefully we'll be meeting soon again. Thanks a lot once again, Dr. Robert Spicer, Hope to
Thank
see
you.
soon here. Thank
And
you.
it's good to see you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good day.
Let's say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.